carbon come from? I'll start with the most obvious place. We can bring it in from somewhere else. This is one slide and one slide only on this topic. I should emphasize here, my background actually was, I got a PhD in composting, believe it or not. That's what my qualification was. Compost in the right place at the right time are brilliant, as are many other organic amendments. There are many different types: compost manures, biosolids, biochars, and others. Additionality, I raise just from the carbon markets perspective. If you're bringing the carbon in from somewhere else, you've already counted it once. So just bear that in mind if you're thinking about the carbon trading aspect of it. It has to be carbon that comes in addition to the carbon that you brought in. There can be issues with contaminants, not always, but there certainly can be. We had a bit of a discussion about biosolids yesterday in the discussion point. The main reason it's only one slide in my talk is scale. Taking biosolids as an example, and these are ABARES figures. A couple of years ago, there was nearly 350,000 tonnes of biosolids available, according to ABARES statistics. There was about 32 million hectares under cropping, which means you all get 11 kilos each. Now, obviously, that's a silly way to think about it, but in the context of trying to manage carbon at the national scale, this is why I don't tend to spend too much of my time in this space these days. I think locally, in local scenarios, they can be a very useful tool produced from high quality producers who are reputable. If you've got the opportunity, go for it. But frequently being asked to comment at the national scale about how we build carbon across Australian agriculture as a whole, this number isn't going to help too much. So, if we can't bring it in from somewhere else, at least at the national scale, where can we get it from? Well, we get the plants to grow it for us. Net primary productivity. Have people heard that term before? So that's basically the balance of carbon fixed by plants through photosynthesis, after accounting for the fact that plants also respire a fair chunk of that carbon through their own metabolism. And basically, ultimately, it's the upper limit on how much carbon you can add to your system, bearing in mind that there are two things that happen to carbon in your system. It goes in and it goes out again. So this is the tap where it's coming in. The more biomass you can grow, ultimately the more carbon you have going into your system. Whether or not that says anything about how long it stays is a question I'll get to as we move on through the talk. But this comes back to some of those questions about ground cover, and it's an interesting trade-off about trying to grow green stuff in the summer in these regions, and I'll get to some results from Cover Crops project that I led as part of this. Because it's worth bearing in mind that net primary productivity is modified by management. As growers, you have a choice as to what you grow, when you grow it, how you graze it, how you manage it, how you fertilize it. But ultimately, the NPP of the system that you're imposing on the soil is pretty much the upper limit of where carbon is going to come from, unless you happen to be close to a reliable source of external inputs. I think it's about time I mentioned the R word, seeing as I'm already talking about the C word, regenerative agriculture, which is a term that gets bandied around a lot. And it's more interesting, I think, than organic agriculture or biodynamic agriculture, because in both of those systems, you're told what you can and can't do to meet a certain certification. Regenerative agriculture is much more along the lines of trying to do the least worst, is how I'd put it. So, reduce disturbance, maintain cover, be that living or dead. Look at diverse rotations in your cropping systems, or perhaps diverse pastures if you're a pastoralist primarily, including livestock in the systems where you can, and Tom's mentioned this already. And minimize chemicals, not eliminate. Certainly don't take major steps back at once, as has been discussed already several times. Because one thing you have to bear in mind, reduce fertilizer, if you're taking off a lot of N, it has to come from somewhere. So does P. In grazing systems, that is potentially less pressure than in cropping. But if you're taking off several tons of grain, you're taking off 50 to 100 kilos of N, it has to come from somewhere. Before we get to where it comes from, there are other constraints in the soil that you might have to address first. You could have a perfectly fertile 10 centimetre layer, a hard pan or some other constraint just below, and it won't matter how much fertilizer, how much organic amendments you apply at the surface. unless you deal with the soil constraint or find some other way around it. I'm not going to linger too long on this, but this is work from Lynn MacDonald, my colleague at CSIRO, and Therese McBeath, their GRDC-funded sandy soils project, looking at subsoil constraints in sandy soils. This was some of the deep ripping, slotting work, definitely not for the faint of heart, and definitely not to be done willy-nilly, as Amanda can probably talk to as well. But in at least one of those sites, they did have consistent results that were pretty impressive. Increase of 1 tonne per hectare per year over 4 years. Many other sites, they didn't see that. But if you've got a deep, if you've got a hard set pan in your soil that's limiting water infiltration and everything else, doesn't matter how well you manage the top 10 centimetres, the roots need to go much further, and you might need to help them get there. And that constraint may be beyond what you can get a plant to do for you. Slightly less radical approaches, simply improved agronomy and improved varieties, really keeping a higher, more of a focus on this. If you look at some of the results from the hyper-yielding crops work that's being done, they're not achieving that necessarily by throwing on 400 or 500 units of N. Far from it, actually. They're in N deficit from some of the trials I've looked at. What they are doing is being absolutely anal about how they control for choose the right variety, look at when they're applying fertilizer, manage pests appropriately. And this little panel I've put up here from Greg Rebetsky's work on long coleoptile wheat, which is also being done right now on canola as well. So looking at sowing deeper, where the moisture is getting better early establishment, better early vigor. So there are options like that that simply by changing the variety of what you're growing. If you've got better establishment, you've got better early vigor, better MPP, more chance of building carbon. So that's what you can do with the crops that you're already growing. Cover crops have come up a couple of times. I was fortunate enough to lead CSIRO's part of a cover crops project that covered a large swathe of the southern farming systems all the way down to Tassie. The coloured spots are rough rainfall zones, low, medium and high, depending on amber, green or blue. We had a couple of growers in the room who participated in this, notably Jenny and Tom both had demonstration trials at their sites. I could talk for about 2 hours about that project alone, and I probably only have about 20 minutes to talk full stop, and I've probably burnt most of them already. So I will rattle through what is a qualitative summary of the results. High up, you've got the dry sites down to the wettest sites, a whole load of different soil variables that this projector is horrible for, and then averages at the end for the sites and averages at the bottom for each of the variables. Key variables, thankfully the writing is bigger. Moisture content, already discussed. Funnily enough, if you grow a fair chunk of green stuff in summer, you've probably got less moisture at sowing in your winter crop. If you're in an area, which most of us are, where that could be a problem, it's really something you need to take into account. Because if all you achieve is growing a little bit of a summer cover crop, and then cause a major hit that means you get poor establishment of your winter crop too, you're not even getting the soil health benefits that cover crops can bring, because the cash crop is providing some of those too, and that's often forgotten in this space. Nitrate goes down. I don't think that's a negative, because organic nitrogen, microbial nitrogen, and the rate at which organic nitrogen is turned into nitrate and ammonium went up. So what you've done there, and that was fairly consistent across most of the sites, you basically tied up the really labile N and put it into that slower release form of N that Lynn was talking about earlier. Biomass, in most cases, we did have more above ground biomass, but not all the control treatments were business as usual, so the farm management was to be fairly lenient on the weeds rather than spraying out anything that was vaguely green. Then that's what you got as the control. Yield, there are some red blobs, yes, not for the faint of heart, doesn't work everywhere. There are also some green blobs too. Water holding capacity in some of the wetter areas had already been started to be influenced slightly as a result of the increased carbon. And at one site, and bearing one site only out of 20, Jenny is the star, we did have a significant increase in carbon at depth. Fungal richness was also probably one of the most easiest measurements to see we had a difference. Whether or not it was really telling me that much, I I'm not sure about, but again, I have about 50 other slides about that if I had the time. So Jenny's results, where we had an increase of about a tonne per hectare in yield in Jenny's oats in the mixed species cover crop treatment, less in the single species. The exciting one is, again, green is the mixed species colour, whereas the single species and the control follow your classic down the soil profile of concentration of carbon. The green one intersects and diverges and then cuts in below 30 centimetres. So that bigger mixture of roots was pushing more carbon down at depth where we're actually trying to build it. But I should add, as with the conversation about organic amendments, this is very location specific. We had a sniff of it at the other Kangaroo Island site, but it wasn't statistically significant. We didn't really see it at much of the other sites, although it is what is supposed to happen. So at least we found it somewhere. So that's cover crops. What I also want to talk about is nitrogen, and we've had a bit of discussion about this, and I know some of the other speakers will talk about it later. I'm aware it is quite a hot topic, so I'm going to take us back to a little bit of mass balance. This is data from Rob Norton's report that he did for GRDC a few years ago now, looking at nitrogen balance across 125 different cropping sites in the southern region. Every single one of them was exporting more N in the grain than it was bringing in as fertilizer. That doesn't necessarily mean N wasn't coming in via N fixation from legumes if they had them in their system, but certainly when you're looking at the time frame where this work was done, legumes were not that dominant in those areas. And if you're taking more nitrogen out than you're bringing in, go and have a chat with the bank manager about what happens if you do that with money. It has to come from somewhere. And it's important to note that not all potential losses have been accounted for. Where it's coming from to support your crop is from mineralization of organic matter. So you can't easily build organic matter whilst also using more of it than you're replacing. That's something to bear in mind. Now, what I'm talking about here is equally applicable to some extent to a longer term change in system. If you are not keeping track of this, you might be inadvertently stepping towards this area. It would certainly be an issue if you decided, right, my system's been doing really well, so I'm not going to apply fertilizer for the next couple of years. You would need to understand that it is being backstopped by your organic matter. That's not necessarily a bad thing, provided you understand it and manage it and look to replace it. And one thing I think I need to do is clear up a little bit of misunderstanding about nitrogen, and I promise you I am not a nitrogen fertilizer salesperson. But there was a study out of the US that became a bit of an inflection point for a lot of discussion about nitrogen fertilizer and organic matter in soils. And it's this from the Morrow plots. And they had two treatments that they presented, control where they applied no fertilizer, and fertilizer treatment where they were applying fertilizer as manure until the mid-1960s, and then urea thereafter. And when they started applying urea, carbon went down. So applying urea is taking carbon down, apparently. No. What's actually happening is you're not bringing in 3 or 4 tons of organic matter every year anymore. You're still bringing in about the same sort of N. Basically, NPP alone was not capable of maintaining the carbon at that level. And don't take it from me, take it from most of the people who worked at Rothamsted at the time, Dave Jenkinson, Dave Pelson, Keith Goulding, etc. I actually spoke to David about his comment here. He reckoned this was about the most vehement he'd ever written in the scientific literature at all. Because it has caused an awful lot of misunderstanding. If you misuse nitrogen, it is probably going to be pretty poor for your crop and your system, and it's poor for the environment, but used appropriately and carefully, it is quite often necessary, particularly in extractive industries such as continuous cropping. So what we need to do is think about the right amount of nitrogen. And this is another opinion piece from the US in the scientific literature. It's a figure looking, so the grey is below the annual optimum nitrogen rate and white is above it. The fixed line is yield and residue production, so you get to a point where adding more N isn't getting you any more yield or any more residue production. Change in yield per unit of N goes down. We know this because we're normally aiming around here for optimum economic fertilizer application rather than perhaps optimum biomass production. And of course, if you start building complete excess, nitrate goes up. But your optimum for carbon is somewhere closer to optimum biomass production. Whether or not that's economically sensible is a different discussion point. But if you're wanting to build carbon, you might need to be applying more N than you would otherwise be if you were taking a conservative approach to get the best bang for your buck on that nitrogen fertilizer. So getting the balance right, James Hunt at Melbourne University now has been playing around with, well, doing more than playing around with the N-bank for quite a few years now. Obviously, there are risks to wanting to apply more nitrogen, and again, I have a background in composting. PhD title is actually environmental science, so I have thought about this before standing in front of rooms full of growers and talking about nitrogen fertilizer. But what James's approach to the N-bank does, in summary, say 2 key points. You are measuring nitrogen before making your fertilizer decisions every single year, and then you are adjusting the amount that you apply to account for the potential maximal yield, discounting for the fact you've already got a fair amount in the profile. The numbers on there is various different nitrogen bank treatments and some yield profit treatments, and one of the reasons for doing this was ultimately trying to get people to think about nitrogen more carefully, because when we're looking at the numbers, mean gross margin, dollars per hectare, this is averaged over 5 years. And partial imbalance, mean fertilizer application, and summed residue. Those numbers peak at a certain point, and like I say, the comparison to yield profit was the fact that I can stand in front of GRDC updates rooms and ask who uses yield profit, and I might get 2 or 3 hands. It's a useful tool if you use it, but if it's not being used, it's incumbent on us as researchers to find other ways to help growers manage their nutrients. The important thing to remember here is that this isn't advocating for applying a larger amount of N all up at once. Do it carefully, have a split applications as suits your system and the season. But it's not just about nitrogen fertilizer, legumes. I was quite astonished by this data that Rowan Brill has produced in New South Wales. This is looking at several different field trials he had throughout the southern northern region, if that makes sense in GRDC parlance these days. Different colours of different species, which again haven't come out great, but that's fine. Big ones to look for, faba beans are the yellowish ones, lentils are these sky blue ones down here. Total biomass up to and above 15 tonnes per hectare of biomass, peak biomass production of legumes. Total N fixed, again, I'm sorry about the font, up to 600 kilos of N per hectare fixed by that best faba bean crop there. That's a huge amount. That's far more than anybody would be applying as urea in this region. The interesting thing is, what we often hear about grain legumes is that, well, that's great, but all the N goes as the grain. No. At least from these data of Rowan's, in the fabas, in those faba beans, you've got your grain yield of 6 tonnes plus. You've still got a legacy effect into the next year of possibly over 300 units being added to the system. You know, look, these are wetter systems than here. This was a very good year for these crops. It is not the normal. You might be somewhere down here, but even then, 150 units is not to be sniffed at, and might well be 2 or 3 years worth of N in some of the drier areas in South Australia. So legumes can have an important part to play in the system, and in talking with James and others in the N-banking space, you'd bring them into the system, and then you treat your forward N applications on the basis of what N's are present in that next soil crop. And as hard as I guess that if you're following these fabas, the answer would be not very much that you need to apply. Conversely, lentils, which of course are wonderfully profitable, they're not adding much back to the system once you've taken the grain away. So you do need to understand that it's not one rule for all legumes. You need to understand the differences between them. So where does it go? Well, there really has to be an emphasis on the microbial controls, and there is evolving understanding here. There's a bit of a bun fight in the literature right now as to whether or not it's microbes decomposing or MPP that really is the limiting factor for organic matter increase or decrease in soils. The answer is probably both. But it's worth bearing in mind that most organic carbon is not stable. Unless you've got charcoal-like material in there, it is liable to loss through various mechanisms, mostly microbial. It is stabilized by microbes and their interaction with soil particles, as Oliver got us to do earlier this morning. So, Dave Jenkinson from Rothamsted said this in the 70s, that all carbon passes through the microbial biomass. It is the eye of the needle. Some very interesting recent research showing that a chunk of plant carbon might actually go direct to these stabilization sites without any microbes playing a part in it, but nonetheless microbes are still central. And the key number here is this carbon use efficiency number. Basically microbes like you and I, we use some of the nutrients that we eat to grow. Sadly, these days when we get to our age, we grow outwards rather than upwards, but a lot of it goes off as CO2 or other products. That's basically, when you hear about the carbon use efficiency number, that's what the microbes are doing. And this is where the interesting thing about this root exudates comes back in. Root exudates are much easier for microbes to digest than lignin-y type things that take a lot of energy to make the enzyme to break them down in the first place. Whether or not carbon use efficiency is more important than NPP, I don't think we can answer that yet, but it is very clear that they're both important. The question I now have is, how the heck do we manage this directly as land managers? And that's a more difficult thing to manage than how much green stuff you grow in the first place. So yes, losses. This is data from the classical Rothamsted experiments. Control, no fertilizer additions, manure addition maintained. Manure addition stopped in the late 1800s, and carbon goes back down again. Looks very similar to that one, really. It's the same story. Nitrogen's just not able, nitrogen fertilizer alone is just not capable of maintaining this because far more carbon's being brought back in. So to wrap up, well, we're in a water-constrained system here mostly, and that's where cover crops and summer active species do need to be carefully thought about, because you do run the risk, if you're in a system that is really reliant on banked water rather than in-season rainfall, of taking yourself backwards. Most of us in cropping world are now doing what is current best practice, maintaining stubble, minimal disturbance. As with those changes, when you see a reduction in manure application, sadly going backwards happens much quicker than going forwards, usually. And I would still argue that increasing net primary productivity is key. So with that, I'd like to thank the various funders who've paid for me to be here and do the work that I've presented, and mentors and colleagues, and particularly technical staff without whom I'd have no data to talk about at all. Thank you very much.